Hello, everybody. Wonderful to see you all here. We are the hardcore at the COP, and it's great to see everyone still looking so enthusiastic and radiant. Long may it last, and I hope it's a good sign for what's to come in the next few days from the big negotiating room. We hope so. We're here today to talk about possibly what is one of the most important and certainly one of the most pressing issues that is being discussed here in Dubai at COP28, and that is how to catalyze climate adaptation investments, particularly in the most vulnerable geographies, among the most vulnerable communities on Earth. Those parts of the world affected by conflict, that are fragile, who feel the impacts of climate change most acutely, and yet in many cases are the least well-equipped to deal with it. But this is not going to be a panel of depression and gloom. It is going to be a panel where we are sharing solutions, sharing ways that we can work together, hearing from some of those countries where they are doing the work, learning from you, hearing the needs of your people, and putting our heads together as to what we can do about it. So I'm really delighted to be introducing the first part of our discussion, which is to hear from those who are on the front line, who are handling this, to hear a little of your perceptions. And then I'm going to invite my colleague Pradeep Kurukula Surya, who is the head of the Director of Global Environmental Finance at the UNDP, which is, of course, leading a lot of the work here. And he's going to be moderating a panel which is really getting into the detail of the kinds of solutions we're looking at. I want to say, first of all, that my name is Shireen Wheeler. I'm from the European Investment Bank, one of the co-organizers of this event, alongside our colleagues at the Islamic Development Bank, with whom the EIB, of course, works extremely closely. The work of the MDBs is obviously more valuable when it's done together. I want to introduce the panel. So I have a great friend, it's turning out now, at this COP28, the Minister for Environment from the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, Lalia Ali Kamara. Great to see you again. We have Mr. Bahadur Sherali Soda, who is Chairman and Minister from the Committee of Environmental Protection in Tajikistan. Great to see you as well. We're very happy also to have Ambassador Gamal Hassan, who is the director of IGAD, which is the Center of Excellence for Climate Adaptation and Environmental Protection. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. Maybe I can kick off with you, Minister, and help us to set the scene. Tell us a little bit about the particular challenges that your country, Mauritania, is facing in terms of adapting to the impacts of climate change, but also whether you think that finance, international finance, is currently structured in a way that actually is working to meet the needs of your country and the communities, and whether you can share any solutions that you think could help to overcome these barriers. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you to give me this opportunity. And again, I would like to thank EIB and the Islamic Development Bank for organizing this session. And I'm truly honored to be a part of this high-level discussion on this crucial matter. As you know, Mauritania is a Saharan country, and we are facing significant environmental challenges, with 83% of our territory being a desert. And we have lost 30% of arable land during the last 30 years, since the 90s exactly. So the visible impact of climate change, such as a rising temperature, a drought, and desertification, have led to concerning rural exodus, compromising economic and social conditions, and exerting pressure on our natural resources. Our country copes with a continuous degradation of essential resources for rural survival, including water, but also forestry, pastoral, agricultural lands. And since the profound droughts, since the 1980s to the 1970s, and the 1980s, we have experienced a dual challenge of rural exodus from the rural areas to the big cities, and the migration toward coastal urban centers, creating a tension between natives and migrants, especially in rural areas. In the face of this complex context, Mauritania strives to maintain a peace and security. This peace is contingent to harmonious development and a comprehensive economic approach involving large-scale investment to counter terrorism and organized crime. As you know, Mauritania, from the 5 countries that comprise the Sahel bloc, is one of the peaceful countries today. We have our neighbors that are facing insecurity, terrorism, so we want to maintain this peace. And to achieve those goals, Mauritania needs support, and our needs are quite clear. The first need we have is that we require an availability of reliable data, and in all environmental aspects, to inform our strategic decision-making process. I can name the ecosystem data, but also the phonistic data on the soil, on the temperature, and it's important that we gather those accurate and technical and data that is coming from technical means to make sure that we can measure. Because for me, it's important to be able to measure, to be able to improve what we are doing. Secondly, we aim to implement large-scale projects because today we have many small-scale projects, and it's time-consuming for us, and sometimes the impact is not visible. So we have developed already all the strategies, the action plans, and the instrument that the international convention that we have signed requires. So I can name the CDN, but also the national adaptation plans that we have in our country. But yet our current projects are limited by financial size, as I said, lacking of support from larger funds such as DCF, but also the International Development Bank. So we are actively working today on significant projects seeking partnership from AIIB, but also from the Islamic Bank, from the African Development Bank. I can name the rural electrification, make sure that you have mini-grids in remote areas, in rural areas where there's no electricity and where the impact of the population living there is very important on our environment. We have a problematic of cutting trees, making from those trees coal because they need energy for the cooking. So it's important that we make available those mini-grids in the remote areas. The second large project that we are working on is a development of green jobs across various sectors. Agro-industry, recycling, energy, construction, to make sure that we put together the private sector and the people who are working in the rural areas to make sure that there is a partnership between the private sector and those associations to make sure that they have the means to scale up their production, the transformation of agro-industry products, to make sure that they can buy it, they can sell it, on the markets, on the larger market with better quality. So to realize all those projects and address those pressing challenges, we need also technical assistance. I think today we are a large country in terms of geography. It's 1 million square kilometers, but we have a small population of 4 million. And really the human resources issue is something that we have to cope with every day. And so it's important for us to have technical assistance to build those projects and so also to implement them. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you also for drawing so clearly the connection between climate action and security, which is absolutely critical, that the lack of action will only exacerbate the pressure that you're facing and potentially increase the conditions for conflict, which I think is immensely important, but also for giving us those very concrete examples of the kind of needs that you're facing as well, and what solutions could come from colleagues here in this room among them. Let me just, before we carry on, welcome also Mr. Ahmed Yusuf Ahmed, who is Director General of the Directorate of Environment and Climate Change in Somalia. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. May I now turn to you, Minister Sherali Zoda. Give us a sense from Tajikistan, what are the challenges you're facing? And can you share with us again some of the needs, but also some potential solutions where you could be partnering with others to address them?
Thank you, Shirin. Distinguished panelists, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to express our gratitude for European Investment Bank and the Islamic Development Bank for convening this important event on catalyzing climate adaptation investment in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Let me give a little bit of the context from Tajikistan. It's a mountainous, landlocked country with around 10 million population, and we have one of the lowest GHG emissions globally, but at the same time, we are one of the most vulnerable, given our 93% of the terrain is high mountains, and 70% of the population live in rural areas, or their livelihoods depend on the agriculture. And 60% of the water resources of Central Asia spring from glaciers of Tajikistan. And Tajikistan has been very proactive on the water diplomacy, and last year, at the initiative of our president, the UN adopted resolution on 2025 as International Year of Glacier Preservation. And we, despite being a developing country, landlocked and vulnerable to climate change, we have made a financial pledge to activate the UN Trust Fund on glaciers, so which shows our commitment on this issue. Tajikistan has huge hydropower potential, and we have the capacities to export to excess of electricity generated from the hydropower to neighboring countries, which means that they use clean energy to shut down their thermal power plants and reduce their GHG emissions through the existing unified Central Asian grid system, or also through the ongoing project of CASA 1000. It's more high voltage transmission line from Tajikistan to South Asia through the territory of Afghanistan to Pakistan. Tajikistan has, since independence, experienced devastating civil war from 1992 to 1997. And we share the longest border with Afghanistan. It's approximately 1,400 kilometers of difficult terrain of border with Afghanistan. And which means that we face not only security challenges, but also, for instance, just give you one example, last year during the, we had an extreme cold winter in Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And we have seen reports that people in Afghanistan were selling their children to provide for the rest of the family. And we, as a neighboring country, we have cross-border bridges, bridges between the Tajikistan and Afghanistan along the Amur River. We have opened these bridges to have this cross-border trade or markets and to help the neighboring country. And also there was some migrant influx to Tajikistan. So these are the humanitarian challenges which we are facing, and we are coping with it on a day-to-day basis. And on what could be the solutions, and Tajikistan is very active. We have submitted our nationally determined contribution updated nationally determined contribution with ambitious mitigation and adaptation targets to the UNFCCC, and we have highlighted there both the mitigation and adaptation targets with without international support, but also the with scenarios with significant international support. It's clear that we will need more focus on adaptation, and we have prepared the financial plan for the NDC implementation. Of course, we have these different strategies, different plans, but it comes to the implementation and where the real, let's say, game is. And for the implementation, unfortunately, there is a lack of the capacity for us maybe to prepare some bankable projects. Of course, we have prepared this financial plan. We identified we know the vulnerable sectors, priority sectors. But what it lacks that we need to, from this general, let's say, financial plan, we need to move one step further. For this, we will need technical assistance to prepare the fully fledged project proposals, which we could submit to different environmental funds or the multilateral development banks. And also, the resource mobilization is critical aspect for us. We are now working with, for instance, through different mechanisms like NDC partnership to circulate or to present our needs. But I think there is more need, because we see in the negotiations that least developed countries or small island developing countries getting more attention. But the challenges which I mentioned, that like civil war, being very mountainous, and the frequency and intensity of the climate-induced disasters in our country is increasing. And as I mentioned, 70% of the population living in rural areas, their livelihoods, and we have huge economic losses from the climate-induced natural disasters. So for this, I think there need to be more focus, or how we can maybe find different platforms where we could present the challenges and what are our priorities, and where we could maybe connect with different stakeholders, which could help us maybe first with the technical assistance, and then we move. And one of the examples of good cooperation between different multi-stakeholder cooperation was in Tajikistan, the pilot program of climate resilience, where the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Asian Development Bank, and other stakeholders gathered, and they prepared this big program on different sectors, and it had a huge impact. Like there was a component on the technical assistance, capacity building, but also work on the ground, and different projects on the energy sector and other sectors, which brought, as I mentioned at the end, big impact on the ground. So maybe we will need some kind of this more programmatic approach.
And that's very interesting, because we've seen from the multilateral development banks this week, actually, a statement which very much puts that at the center, a country-led approach, a long-term strategy approach, where the MDBs are working better together, and clearly that's something that would resonate with you. Thank you very much for giving us that vivid picture of Tajikistan's challenges, but also some very concrete messages for those working in this area who are in the audience, especially on the technical assistance point, the capacity building, which I know we'll come back to. So perhaps before I go to you, Ambassador Hassan, I could turn to Mr. Ahmed from the Directorate of Environment and Climate Change in Somalia, and maybe invite you to give us a little bit of a picture as well of the challenges specifically that you're facing uniquely in your own country, but also perhaps a perspective on how you think the finance is working, whether it's reaching the right places, how you think it could do better, and some examples of that. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and I thank you, the panelists, and I thank you, everyone who is participating in this important event, which is catalyzing climate adaptation investments in fragile and conflict-affected countries, and also conflict-affected countries. So if I speak a little bit in Somalia, Somalia is a country which is in Horn of Africa and neighboring with Kenya, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And probably our livelihood is depending on climate sensitive areas like livestock and also agricultural activities. This is not good at this time because of climate change. As you are aware, that Horn of Africa has already faced on long-time droughts for the last 3, 4, 5 years. But also now, recently, also Horn of Africa, including Somalia, is facing a huge flooding, and I think you are aware of what they call El Nino is taking place there. Almost more than 150 people has already died, and it has washed a lot of infrastructures like roads and so on and so on, and also there are some destructions and disturbances within the livelihoods of the local people, those who live in some regions within Somalia. Some of them also, it has also caused huge IDBs and displacement. There are a number of people who left their homes. At this time that I'm talking, the IDBs, and I think waiting the government and also international partners to come and at least to do something. So climate change and conflict, they have a relationship, and we have seen the evidence that is whenever there is a drought, whenever the climate change impact is, maybe it's going to reduce the water availability, and then from that time, people who has the livestock or also maybe dependent on agricultural activities, they need enough water to get. In that angle, or maybe area, people, they used to fight how to get water, and you can see how they relate. And there are really a big number of laws that we experienced for the last 5 years or maybe 10 years due to, caused by water vulnerability, water shortage, and so on and so on. So, and another evidence is that whenever the community, they lost their livelihoods, whether it's agricultural or whether it's livestock, they will be IDBs. And from that time, they used to come up maybe, or maybe at least it creates another urbanization and so on and so on. So those urbanization also needs a lot of services. It needs health, it needs education, and also hygiene and all those things. Sometimes even that causes a lot of conflict and a lot of pressure to already existing policies, maybe or services which already was very, very limited by even before they came to, or maybe before they moved from their original to maybe the urbanization and so on. So we can see the conflict, we can see how, it's causing, and I think, as I've already mentioned, we are depending on those sensitive factors which are the livestock and agricultural activities. Another, maybe it's good, but the Somalis people are not taking advantage on that, is that Somalia has one of the longest coastline in Africa, 3,300 and plus. But the issue is even that it needs a huge investment, and investment is not there because there are a lot of untapped resources within the Somali oceans. So I think due to the adaptation mechanism, it's important the government of Somalia and the people of Somalia, and I think international partners, to work together to at least advocate how we can do something on the ocean resources.
Absolutely.
When it comes to the climate finance, Somalia, if you read all the reports, if you read all the recently published report, it's one of the most vulnerable country in the region now. But if you read climate finance, how much funds that Somalia has received so far is really, I can't tell even, it's less than maybe some 2-3 million, something like that. So you can easily understand how it's very bad, and we cannot I think it's something we can't talk. But there are many other steps that I can share with you that we have already taken. The government of Somalia has developed its NDC. My friend, His Excellency Ambassador Jamal, is sitting just here now, used to be the former Minister of Planning, and I think I and also the minister and also some other government officials, we used to drafted the first NDC, and we submitted to UNFCCC 2021 in July. And another good news is that we recognize that we still need to improve, and recently we have updated with the support of UNDP and FAO. And now the current estimate budget that Somalia needs is 17 billion from now to 2030. I think it's 6 years, something like that. And most of that, since Somalia is not releasing a GHG, a greenhouse gas emission that Somalia releases, it's insignificant. So we more focus on adaptation rather than mitigation. We focus on water, we focus on renewable energy, we focus on food security, and so on and so on. So I think that's one of the positive steps that I can share, and let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think also, just picking up on one of the many very rich points you made there, of course, is the key thing of the oceans, the role of the coastline. And actually, at an earlier event with the minister from Mauritania, we were talking about this very thing as well. The vulnerability, but also the opportunities that that can provide in terms of international financiers and those coming in. Thank you very much for giving us those vivid pictures of from your own countries, which of course are particular and unique, but also provide some common challenges for the world and for countries that are facing conflict and fragility. And so maybe I can turn to you, Ambassador Hassan. You work for you're the director of the Center for Excellence for Climate Adaptation and Environmental Protection. What can you sort of glean from some of those really, I mean, challenging doesn't begin to describe it, does it? Situations that these countries are facing, and where do you think we maybe need to do things differently in terms of the finance, and where can we already see good models that we can go forward on?
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing. Thank you to the European Investment Bank and the Islamic Development Bank for organizing this great event. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good day, I think it's noon. I just want to give you an overview of the numbers when it comes to adaptation finance. I'm talking about IGAD region. IGAD is an intergovernmental authority on development in East Africa, comprised of 8 countries. So IGAD is one of the most vulnerable regions in Africa, in the world. So I just want to give you what we need, where we stand, and how are things happening in our region and across the developing world. So we all know the NAPs, the NDCs, and how these things work. We submit to UNFCCC, we budget, we cost, and then try to implement whatever we can. But there are always gaps, and there are always areas that we need to come together. So as a region, we came together and created something we call the Regional Climate Adaptation Strategy, which finds synergies, fills the gaps, and also proposes solutions. The strategy spotlights key emerging issues, including climate, peace and security, loss and damage, and also leveraging the indigenous knowledge as well as artificial intelligence. So it's a very comprehensive document, and it was launched here a few days ago at the beginning of the COP. So this blueprint for boosting the region's resilience to climate change is very clear and achievable. But without collective action towards climate financing, the sustainable future envisioned by this innovative and commendable strategy will go unrealized. I'm saying this because we have been through many meetings and COPs and events where pledges were made, commitments were signed, and the implementation of those commitments most likely never materialize. So how do we finance this kind of strategy? So developed countries most responsible for the climate crisis, as we all know, developed their economies through high-emitting industrial activity. Yet they are failing to mobilize the climate finance needed for some of the most vulnerable regions around the world. And for example, between 2020 and 2030, Africa requires an average of $250 billion a year. But in 2020, domestic and international climate finance account for just under $30 billion. So you can see the gap already. Our region, IGAD, 8 countries put together, receives significantly smaller portion of the flow of global finance compared to similar regions. For example, the DG just talked about the situation in Somalia. Somalia, which is the most vulnerable, or second most vulnerable country in Africa when it comes to climate change, received less than $300 million in climate finance last year. They are going through El Nino, 6 failed rainy seasons, and also intermittent flooding. You have flooding, you have drought, and now you have El Nino. So almost 2 million people were displaced in the last couple of months, over 100 people died, and so on and so forth. So this kind of country, in this kind of situation, receives the least amount of climate finance when it comes to adaptation finance. So we have, I think most of you know, Climate Policy Initiative, a website that compiles and puts together numbers. If I give you the latest numbers, for example, Djibouti requires $5 billion a year, Eritrea 1.1 billion, Sudan 1.4, Ethiopia 1.6 billion, Kenya 6.2, South Sudan 10 billion, Uganda 7 billion. Yet when you compare all this, I think a meager percentage reaches the region. Talk about climate finance. And you know, adaptation, people say, is the orphan child of the mitigation. So we have 10 instruments when it comes to climate finance in mitigation, and we only have 2 for the adaptation. So you can see the gap already. Now, some of the donors, the key donors, for example, the USAID, they put out a study a couple of years ago, and they said every dollar invested in adaptation and resilience saves $3 on humanitarian assistance down the line. So we already know if we build the resilience, then we can minimize the humanitarian interventions that we have to do when disasters happen. So for vulnerable countries, the costs of failing to act are starkly apparent. Between 2020 and 2022, droughts in Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, as well as floods in South Sudan, cost the region 2 to 4% of its annual GDP. So you're talking about the entire GDP benefit, because these countries their economies are based on agriculture, and when there is flooding, the flooding washes away the soil, the farmlands. When there is drought, the livestock dies. So you can imagine the hit the GDP takes when it comes to this kind of crisis. Adaptation finance is therefore key to enable these countries to proactively prepare for the onslaught of climate change. And we're not asking basically money to flow to the region. We're asking people to invest with us, because there's also a lot of investment within the countries, as we outline in the NAPs of the member states. So there are areas that we can collaborate when it comes to the banks, for example, and the big donors. The countries in the developed countries in the global north, for example, generated 92% of the total emissions. And our region contributed less than 1%. The entire African continent contributed less than 4% of the global greenhouse gas. Yet we disproportionately suffer of the climate impact, which was not of our making. So we have to talk the walk. We have to walk the talk. Make sure that whatever finance we're doing, it has to be targeted, and we have to do justice. So now, we, as a region, we put together a strategy, we unified our position, we presented here, and we launched at the COP, yet without collaboration in the form of climate financing from friends here and others, the likelihood of that strategy become another document is very high. So we need to make sure that when we forward a strategy or a document that the whole region or the whole continent is behind, I think we need to use that and finance it accordingly. Now, the way adaptation finance is done in Africa is either two ways, either grants or concessional. As I said earlier, you have 10 instruments in the mitigation. So we have proposals and solutions. For instance, we have debt for nature swaps, we have debt for climate swaps, and we have other mechanisms that we can use because most of the countries have all kinds of unsustainable debts that they have to pay. 60% of the tax they collect goes to paying the taxes, paying the debts. So we can talk about swapping those debts for climate, swapping those debts for nature, and so on and so forth. So there are so many ways that we can tackle the situation. According to Henrik Paul Stiftung, a European, I think, German institution, the projected economic cost of loss and damage in developing countries by 2030 stands between 290 billion and 580 billion annually, and is expected to reach a staggering 1 to 1.8 trillion by 2050. So here, COP, we adopted loss and damage. And we're very pleased to announce that we're going to issue the first loss and damage report at this COP. So we will bring the report. There's no more excuse. So here's the report, here's the data, here are the numbers. And this is what this German institute said. By 2050, it will be 1 to 1.8 trillion. So finally, at COP28, and in this meeting, it's imperative that we address this staggering gap in climate financing. This conference and this meeting and this whole COP offers the opportunity to commit to fair financing so the world can work together to stem emissions and prepare for the worst impacts of the crisis. We must seize this moment and do our part to ensure a viable future for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both for bringing your work to this panel, but also to the COP as a whole. It's clearly very precious, and for underlining so articulately, so eloquently, perhaps is a better word, not just the equity, the humanitarian issue, which is overwhelming and staggering, as you say, but also that this is about good economics and investment opportunities as well. So I know that everyone in the audience has been listening closely to what you've been talking about. Now is the time to deep dive into that a little bit with some of those working on the ground who represent not just financiers, but also indigenous communities as well. I'm going to hand over to the capable hands of my colleague Pradeep from the UNDP. But before I do, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for your really rich comments. Minister Kamara from Mauritania, Minister Sherali Zoda from Tajikistan, Director General of the Environment and Climate Change Directorate, Mr. Ahmed, and of course Ambassador Hassan. Thank you so much for that vivid presentation from all of you. So don't go away.
Okay, so can we get the second panel? You may sit here? Yes, please do. Do we have Dauda in the room? Oh, he's here. Oh, yes, you are. Yeah, how do you want to? No, just how many are we? We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep. Just up it. I think I might actually be in front of you, and I might just talk to you. Yeah.
These chairs like really hard to move. need like someone, yeah, there's no wheels. I thought it was wheels.
Amazing, it's a woman panel.
Oh, this is unprecedented.
There was only one woman. Now,
Yeah, you're not allowed. It's because of your magic flowers.
All right. We're going to do something a little bit differently in this panel because I don't know about you, but I have been to so many panels this last 2 weeks that I think I want a different format. I want a conversation, and I want you to be part of the conversation. I want the panelists to also have a conversation, so no monologues, right? Let's talk about this issue on catalyzing finance in fragile contexts in a way that I think we can all engage, because at the end of the day, I think for me, the purpose of these panels and side events is really to talk. We're here to share information, and all of you in the audience have incredible ideas, and sometimes I feel that it's a little bit frustrating when we can't get you into the conversation. So you might see me walking around a little bit, and I may actually point you for a comment. So please engage, right? Because we're all here to learn. There's no right or wrong answer. We all have different experiences, and it's important to get that into the conversation. So I'm Pradeep Kurukulasuri. I'm the Director for Environmental Finance at UNDP. We help countries access resources from various funds, but I don't talk about it proudly, because at the end of the day, even though we may be one of the larger entities through which some of these funds flow, it's nothing compared to what's needed. So it's nothing to sing and dance about. We have to all do more. And I think in that context, the issue of leveraging, catalyzing larger streams of private finance is absolutely critical. And in that context, I think here we are talking particularly about fragile contexts. Without further ado, let's get into this. And please do introduce yourself very briefly as you take the microphone. I do believe we have one colleague online, don't we? He can see us. We can see him. Could we see him so that we can? He also can feel part of this conversation, if that's possible. If not, let's get to it. So first, fragility and financing. Is this an oxymoron? And especially if we think about financing from the private sector. Okay, let's go. Who wants to take a crack at that? IFAD, Dina, come on.
so hotspots.
Hotspot, let's do it. I mean, let's be honest here.
So first of all, thank you very much for having us here. This is really, for us, core to the mandate of IFAD. IFAD was established in the early 70s as a result of very similar situation to what the world is facing now. Global food price crisis, there is oil price crisis. It was a lot of, a confluence of all these issues that we're facing today. So we find ourselves very much in the same space, and we feel that we have, played a role also and continue to play a role. So I had to introduce myself, of course. I'm Dina Saleh. I am the Regional Director from IFAD for the Near East, North Africa, Europe, Central Asia, and the Horn of Africa. So I usually say Morocco to Kyrgyzstan and Sudan. And it covers a lot of the hotspots of today's, what we witness in today's world. So climate finance and fragile. First of all, the way we look at fragility in IFAD is it's multidimensional. I think the first thing is to kind of disconnect this notion of conflict is fragility, because fragility takes form in many forms and shapes. We are, of course, in times of polycrisis. And I think if you look at it, the most vulnerable people are the ones who are the most impacted when it comes to any type of fragility. They have less resilience, they are most vulnerable. And if when we just heard from Ambassador Hassan, we're 660 billion climate finance flows only less than 4.3% of that goes into agri-food sectors. And 0.8% of that goes to small-scale agri-food sector. So this is globally. And in order, a conservative approach to get to the real nuts of this is to have 7-fold increase. So, for us at IFAD, we're actually very concerned by, we try to play our part. I think partnerships is extremely important here. And to try to bring together the discourse on the global stage to make sure that we are really addressing these, yeah.
So let me, maybe, Dauda, I'm going to pull you into this. Look, my question still remains. Are we, I think what I'm hearing, from my experiences and from IFAD is that it is possible, there definitely is a need to drive finance. My question is rather, can we? I mean, are we so confident that in those types of contexts, we can drive your finance towards those opportunities? You work in a bank. I mean, when you look at fragile context, you're obviously looking at it from a bank perspective. Talk us through that. What's in the back of your mind?
Thank you. So, Dauda Njai, I'm the manager of climate and environment at the Islamic Development Bank. So, 31 out of our 57 member countries are considered as fragile or in conflict-affected countries. So, a big chunk of our business is in fragile countries. Okay. So it means that we have found ways, developed ways to provide finance.
Tell me 3 ways you've done it.
So, I mean, basically, fragile countries still, in many cases, are still able to receive regular financing from development banks. So I will start with that category, right? Okay. If you start naming the countries, people will start. No, but what I want to say is, when you say fragile, it's quite large. So you would hear about a country and say, is it a fragile country? Right. You know. So in that category of countries, we have, regular financing that is provided, but also opportunities for concessional financing is also provided. But in conflict setting areas, we have had now a very long relationship with specific organizations that we know can go to the ground and, provide the type of support that needs to be provided. So here we combine regular financing, concessional financing, and also some innovative financing in terms of resources that are provided. For example, there are a few trust funds within the bank, endowment from anonymous sources that goes to countries like Palestine and other settings, and those, for a very long time, the bank has been able to provide financing in those settings through the use of local organizations.
Okay. So great. So we've established we can do it. We've established that there are ways to do it. What then do you think is missing to scale things?
I'm going to start actually answering your first question, which is, can we do this? And my answer to that is that we absolutely must do it. There is no other option. Climate change is unfair, and we know that. There is no justice. The most vulnerable continue to be even more so. But climate action must be fair, must be just, and a way of supporting situations affected by conflict and fragility is, in our view, in the European Investment Bank, doing 2 things. One is really to protect livelihoods, so protecting particularly natural resources, water and fertile land. And this is something that we heard again and again in the first segment of this session. Land and water are 2 of the key resources essential
for maybe reducing risk of fragility and conflict, because access to these natural resources may, in fact, drive inequalities and tension. So one action that we can all do, and I think we can all agree on, is really to protect these natural resources and the livelihoods associated with those. And this can be done many different ways, targeting certain sectors, like the water sector, ensuring that that particular sector moves to a more resilient path, maybe transforming the way water is sourced, distributed, and provided. And we have some experience with that, certainly, even in situations of fragility and conflict in the European Investment Bank. And the other point I would make is creation of employment. Again, that's something that we can do and we can act upon. We have the instruments to do that. And it's a way, again, of reducing inequalities and creating opportunities for different social groups. I'm talking about women, young entrepreneurs, maybe small and medium enterprises in those countries and the regions. And we can do that through working with national development banks, providing the financing that is needed really to create employment opportunity. I will conclude by introducing myself, because I didn't do that, Pradeep, if you allow me.
Please.
So,
go ahead.
I am Cinzia Loseno. I am the adaptation finance leader at the bank, and I'm very happy to be part of this event.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, heads up to the audience that I'm going to come to you next. But before that, you talked about justice, just financing. You talked about instruments such as using national development banks. I actually want to go to you now and bring in indigenous peoples, because an element of this is also about ensuring that the financing reaches where it's most needed. From your perspective, what is then the best way to receive these larger sums of financing, assuming we can get to that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and hi, everyone. And I'm really happy about this panel. The previous one, I have only my sister Kamara as woman, and here we are experiencing you as male. So that's one thing we need to work on it. So my name is Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. I'm from Chad. I'm one of the UNSG-SDG advocate, and of course in Chad, one of the ambassador at the Chad presidency. But here, I'm the co-chair of the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change. Being in the Sahel, and then being from the communities who are nomadic pastoralists, I think no one can tell us how climate change is related with the conflict that we are living every single day. And not conflict that between countries that we are talking about, but between communities that are fighting each other to get access to a fertile land or to the piece of the clean water, because climate change is becoming a big issue that the natural resource is shrinking. And of course, as again, my sister, Madam Minister, said very well, it is the one who is taking all the terrorist issues around all the land, because they are finding the fragile place. And then we are talking like here about the funding, about the climate funding, the money, of course, the private from the bank, but also from the climate fund. Where is the money? Do you think that the money is going to the communities? If it's going there, I think we can mitigate so many things, and then the conflict will be mitigated there. So what we can do to really change is the system. The system that the collaboration between the bank and then in the fragile country, as you call it, so it's not going in the right hand. Do you think that the communities have the access to those funding we are talking about, the billions? I give you one example. In the COP26, we had 1.7 billion for indigenous peoples. We all celebrate, we say, finally, the money is coming. We went to the last COP, only 8% went to the indigenous peoples. 83% of this money went back to the same system. UN agencies, big government organizations, big NGOs. And now when we are here, we ask them, where is the money? Only 2% went to the communities. Are we going really to resolve this issue with the system? So we come up with the solution. We say, you do not know how to work on mitigate all the conflict over resources. We are coming to give you the examples. So we set up a right best approach for the direct access finance to the communities. It is the bankers who can adapt to my grandmother. It's not my grandmother who can be adapt to the banker. So my grandmother cannot fill an Excel sheet. She cannot do 1,000 of report. But the banker knows that my grandmother can protect the land to keep all her children there who can mitigate the conflict. So it's not my grandmother who can adapt to him. So how the bank system can change and give the direct access finance by building the trust. We trust the bankers, they destroy the nature. It's the time that they trust us to rebuild the nature by giving us this funding directly.
Great. Okay, so audience, you've heard some exciting comments here. Anyone want to add to this?
First of all, I'd like
Hello, I'm Cristina Moncayo from Ecuador. I want to share the experience of my country. We are really engaged to NDCs and fulfill everything, but we are really stuck in the money because we don't have money. We are a poor country. We just, in 20 of August, we vote. All the population vote against the fuel, to keep the fuel on the soil, because my country is basically petroleum country, based economy. So we refuse that. We keep it in the ground. But now we have no money. We have 1 billion less in our budget. So how we can do to be another option, you know, because this is not sustainable solution. We want to do that. We want to change the system of petroleum. We are not touching the petroleum in the Amazonia because the animals and all the forest is more value than the petroleum. But now it's impossible to keep that promise together. The next year we will change government in 16 months, and maybe they will change again and say, no, we need to explode the petroleum. And our world, our communities vote against that, and the government will continue doing the opposite that we want. So I ask you to help me to find a solution to get some money for my country for these positive actions that we are proving the work we do. We vote, we have now a law who say don't touch the Amazonia, but we have no money for continue that thing. So make it real. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so Claire, I'm going to come to you. Political instability. I'll come to you next in a minute, sir. Political instability. You know, the disregard for policy and regulations. You know, certain controversial decisions about what to invest in. How are you finding through your experience through the Red Cross? What does it take to operate and drive finance in fragile contexts? Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm from the International Committee of the Red Cross. My name is Claire Dalton. I'd first like to acknowledge, I think there is certainly, we've come a really long way. Just the fact that myself as a humanitarian organization, my sister from Chad coming from a grassroots organization, are sitting on a panel with multinational banks and development banks is really important because we are trying harder to work together. But of course, there are a lot of very real obstacles and barriers. And I think we're getting closer to understand what some of these are. And I think we've seen, I mean, you say that very eloquently, several people pointed to that. You know, a lot of the money, particularly around adaptation, we've seen it isn't going to the most fragile or conflict-affected countries. So what happens next with all these new funds is they must take into account some of the things that have made this difficult in some of these past interventions. And I think, of course, conflict and fragility, they're not the same. However, they interplay in many different ways. I think we all know the impact of conflict on infrastructure, on agriculture, on all the things we're talking about, but also on the community's capacity to bear all these shocks. And I think as the ICSC, we see very much, I mean, as you said, it's very, very important to see and listen to the communities in terms of what makes sense for them. But so what's the bigger problem? I mean, in our experience, and I think many humanitarians would agree with that, it's risk sharing. You know, it is difficult to work in conflict-affected countries for a variety of reasons. And equally, many people may not be under sort of state infrastructure. Maybe the state cannot work in certain parts of these fragile or conflict-affected countries. So these people are often left behind. And it's very difficult. I think we appreciate for banks, particularly some of the bigger entities, it's not easy to invest in these places because of the risks. So I think what we need to do as a community is balance and share those risks better and differently. So I'm not quite sure what that looks like because it's very context specific. I think we have to look at the context, we have to listen to the communities, to the government, to the key stakeholders, but we need to design funds that are better able to disperse money where it's needed, and quite fast, because I think we've seen that the needs are very pressing.
Okay, so great. We've established a couple of things in this intervention. One, we know that public finance needs to be much more than what it is. It needs to go to places much faster, and we need to find different ways for that to happen. The current system is simply not working, and it's not sufficient. But I think you've also raised an issue concerning the flow of private financing. And I think the point you're making is we have to have a different way of risk sharing. Now, I'm going to throw that question to the audience. Have you thought about a different way in which risks can be shared so that it does help provide the confidence to private investors to come into sectors in contexts that they otherwise might not obviously look at? So think about that, because you're going to be on next, but I had a hand up from this side of the room. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdullahi Gaidam. I'm the Executive Director for the Nigerian Center for Climate, Renewal, Resilience and Adaptation. I've attended so many panels, and I've listened to the banks, the multilateral institutions talk about this issue of climate financing. You know, I think we should change the narrative. We should not call it climate investment. I think that is the word we should be using. We should be talking about climate investment. That's one. Two, it is absolutely clear that funds coming from the global south, you know, climate funding coming from the global south, or funding coming from the multilateral institutions to the north, to the south, will not really come. Let's not, I mean, there's no point. I'm not going to sit down here and say, okay, look, billions of dollars are going to come from this to us in Nigeria or to in Africa. I honestly speaking, I've attended so many things that is off the table for me personally. So I think what probably we could do is this. Perhaps the multilateral institutions and the banks, like the Islamic Development Bank, African Development Bank, could perhaps come up with a mechanism on how to unlock local funding that are domiciled in our own countries in Africa. Perhaps that could be a way that we could use those funds to address some of our adaptation and mitigation issues. Because let's be honest, I mean, I'm not going to, we should not hide it. We Africans, we can't hide it. The monies are not going to come. The Europeans have come up with a border, whatever they call it, that on 2026, if you do not meet certain criteria, you cannot export your goods to Europe. So you are already putting in barriers for us to continue to remain where we are. We know this. So please, I think one of the things we could do that could give us, hold on sir, that could give us confidence and give us some peace, is we can talk about a mechanism whereby we can actually unlock private funding or domiciled funding in Africa to address our issues. Help us come up with those mechanisms. Okay. We can work with you on that.
I want to actually stretch you a little bit on this, because you raised an important point, so I'm not trying to cut you off. What is the problem with domestic financing and the need for it to flow? Why do you need the banks to come and do something? What's the issue?
Simple. When you look at the swap, when it comes to nature-based solutions in terms of, there are conditions. The conditions are that you must have a stable political environment. And when you go further to ask them, what are the other conditions, they will tell you. We will not discuss that publicly in this panel.
No.
I'm coming. I'm trying to get somewhere.
Okay.
So the point I'm trying to make is very simple. We may not probably have the mechanisms, we may not have the skills probably to develop that mechanisms. We may need assistance from multilateral institutions and banks.
But what's the issue? Yes. What's the issue? Because you said you've established the following, that there is sleeping domestic capital.
Lack of capacity.
Why is it sleeping?
Well, that's what I'm trying to explain.
Okay.
Lack of capacity perhaps from our local financial institutions.
Okay.
For example, our pension funds.
Yeah.
They may not have the capacity. They may not have identified what I'm even talking about. You understand what I'm trying to say? So it's a new thing for me. I came up with this idea after attending so many panel discussions. I think I've met you, madam. I've tried to discuss that with you. So for me, I think it's important that perhaps you could assist us. Besides, let's be honest, even the banking sector, we borrowed it from the north, from the global north. It isn't our way of banking. So there's nothing wrong with you coming to teach us to say, okay, look, we can give you the capacity so we can have that mechanism for us to be able to unlock local funding to address adaptation and mitigation issues in our country.
Great.
I'm sorry, but I have to react to that. I'm really sorry, I have to react.
Go ahead.
The global north and the banker have an ecological debt on us. We are not asking a charity. They must pay for that. Do you see the impact in our community? Maybe I invite you to come there and see. So it is the system. Yeah. Listen, listen, please. It is the system. It is the financial institutions who must change the system. The financial institutions have been built by the global north who didn't take into consideration the reality of the global south, and they design it always to get more benefit. And they still in that system, and we still like back just to look at the just transitions that we are talking about. We all wanted to go out of the fossil fuel. The only solution we have is the renewable. Where are the minerals for the renewable? Global south. Where are they? In high spot biodiversity. What are they going to serve? Electric car. Do you think electric car is going to serve in Chad? No. Electric car again in the global north. Building in global north. So we wanted to have the equity, justice, and payment back to the ecological debt. It's not a charity, and the bank are making still, even COVID, a lot of benefit. And this money must be invested in nature. And the people who are protecting nature is us.
Okay, great. So my colleague online, I'm going to come to you next, but you've heard any ideas on risk sharing? Anything new we could try?
Sure. As a way of introduction, my name is Arushi, and I'm a graduate student at the Fletcher School at Tufts. To your question, Pradeep, on risk sharing, I don't think this is necessarily novel. A lot of people have written about this now, that public finance and multilateral development bank finance can de-risk private sector investment and make it more amenable for them to be engaged in adaptation. And that's something perhaps you can speak more to, and it's a question that I would pose to you as well. But some of the writers that I have read have talked about how human failure to address climate change is a crisis of imagination. And I think that's really the point where we're at. A lot of the panelists have talked about what the problems are, and those are the questions that you've posed to us. So I want to go back to you and ask you, your collective decades of experience, what do you expect, or what would you like to see by way of creative solutions to mobilize that finance from the private sector, perhaps through the public sector, to communities? And what is the downward/upward flow of information, knowledge that you expect to see?
Great question, but I think that also applies to anyone in this audience. So anyone want to take a crack at it before I head to our colleague online? Yeah, go ahead, here.
Yeah, maybe one short reflection on the comments provided by the colleague on the other side. Investments, they're not coming just alone to some projects. So they should be some kind of leveraged by the state, by other sources to reduce the risks actually, and to share with somebody who has like more, let's say, trust and capabilities. But the question is maybe even more profound, because even if within the country we have a lot of funds, it's very important to explain to the owners of the funds what other benefits are related to the investing, not in like ordinary concrete building, but in more resilient, for example, like nature-based infrastructure and so on and so forth, which means you have to invest more, but what you can get in return to that. And maybe this is like the more, let's say, more, let's say, difficult issue.
Okay.
And yeah, nice to see Pradeep in physically, yeah.
Great. So Habib, you're online. You've been listening to this conversation. Any reflections as the Deputy General Secretary, the G7? Habib, over to you. Do we have him?
Thank you. I'm sorry for very weak connections here. This is fragility that we're living in. Greeting from the G7 Plus Secretariat. First of all, I thank you for the opportunity. I will be very brief, given the fact that I have a very weak bandwidth here. First of all, conflict-affected countries are on the front line of the impact of climate change, and I'm sure you all have heard that many times. Tens of billions of dollars have been spent as emergency response due to climate-induced crisis, And another tens of billions have been committed in the so-called climate fund or climate investment. Yet we have failed to build that necessary resilience in these countries so that they could have the coping capacity with the climate-induced or climate-related shocks. The good news is that this is the first time that conflict-affected fragile countries have been on the headline slot at the COP28. The Declaration on Relief, Recovery, and Peace is a great milestone, and I'm glad that the declaration has benefited from the G7 Plus insight and also endorsement. Now, developed countries and the so-called global north is largely responsible for the climate change, and we, the conflict-affected countries, are affected by the damage that is caused by the global north. Now, the global north is lagging behind in their commitments to the climate funding, and we, the conflict-affected countries, are lagging behind, and there is a huge gap of access to the so-called climate funds and climate investment. Now, against this background, I have only 3 messages to share with you. First of all, the agencies that manage climate funds are bound by rules related to fiduciary and programmatic risk. Hence, decision-making in investing of climate adaptation hinges on those risks, some of which are not real. And many of us spoke about the risk, but before we have to go into the detail, we have to see how much of those risks are real, how much of those are perceived. For the fragile countries to be able to benefit optimally, the custodians of climate funds need to relax those regulations and adopt a true conflict and fragility sensitive approach. Second, almost all conflict-affected countries have as much potential for resilience as other countries do. You just heard from Somalia, from Chad. You know, Somalia has gotten the largest coastline, which is enough to feed all its citizens. My own country, Afghanistan, due to its high altitude, is source of waters for all its neighboring countries, which, if managed effectively, can provide sufficient water for irrigation without even averting the flow of water into other countries. But due to war, fragility, and vulnerability, these potentials are cursed for us. Lack of infrastructure has caused damage for us. Building resilience and adaptation capacity in these countries need resources, and building infrastructure is expensive. Fragmented and disjointed actions by different actors have already divided the pie of available resources into so many slices. Humanitarian, peace, development, and climate actions need to be harmonized, and actors need to complement each other. In other words, we need nexus approach. And very importantly, national ownership in this regard is indispensable. Third, we need to ensure accountability on part of the governments and other actors so that the resources that are committed to climate investment or a climate fund reach those people, and those communities, and those places which need them the most. Now, just to answer the last part of your question, this is neither easy nor impossible wins. Realizing these ambitions depend on the willingness of actors such as multilateral agencies, actors and governments to step out of their comfort zone. Political will on their part is essential. In addition, conflict-affected and fragile countries need to be given the space to have a say in the decision-making in relation to investing in climate funds. As we in the G7 Plus say, nothing about us without us. And we will be happy to work with all those organizations and groups and the multilateral agencies, because we provide a platform to conflict-affected countries that include Somalia and Chad as one of our 2 of our founding members. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Habib. Now, panel, I'm going to come to you next. You each will have 60 seconds to give me one success story of driving finance to the local level. One success story. But before I come to you, sir, over to you. You had something to say.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Eduji Ododo from the Pan-African think tank African Union. I wanted to come back to the issue of resource mobilization, specifically domestically, and to sort of build on what was said on the other side. I think at the basis of that is an issue of trust. So trust in terms of governance and trust in terms of those private sector actors. Because like we said, the resources exist, but how do you, given the context African countries sometimes face, how do you trust that your resources are going to be able to be applied in ways that are going to be able to have an impact? Because examples do exist of situations where, for instance, there's been crowdfunding. In terms of, for instance, infrastructure projects, I believe it's the in Ethiopia, for the Grand Dam, there has been money that was raised by the local population, but that has to go through a process where they feel like the money is going to be able to be accounted for, or there's a degree of trust between private sector or whoever is going to be able to finance those funds, that not only is it going to be used correctly, but that trust in the government or in governance is an issue to unlocking that finance, I believe, and that's something that needs to be addressed if we're going to have the capital that does exist. Thank you.
Great, governance, trust. Okay, so who's going to, I think Cynthia, I'll start with you. Go, 60 seconds.
Okay, so very brief example of what can be done from a very large multilateral development bank like the European Investment Bank supporting a guarantee facility for a national development bank in North Africa to free capital for that bank to then support small and medium enterprises on the ground to recreate the livelihoods and their economic activity after a situation of conflict, and on top of that, a situation of extreme event, drought in this particular country. In that way, we, which are very big and very high transaction costs, will never be able to work with a small farmer, but through this mechanism, we can help a national institution to indeed reach out to those communities we wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. The reason why I'm mentioning this example is because the debate on private sector adaptation is often confused with the need to raise finance from the private sector to support adaptation. And what I often think instead is that we really have to raise public capital to support local private sector to flourish.
Okay, great. Dauda, 60 seconds. Example from the from the Islamic Development Bank where you've had success driving finance in fragile contexts.
Driving finance in fragile contexts, I would say the one that come to mind, the most recent one was how within 24 hours we were able to channel funding to earthquake devastated country 9 months ago. In 24 hours, it was a record within the bank to really go through, identifying the right community, the right organization, have an agreement signed, and having the money disbursed. It was done within 24 hours. Just to give an example of sometimes how you need to go fast.
Can be done.
Yeah.
Dina.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this debate has been fantastic, and I agree with my sister here, but I also agree with my brother there, because I think there are a lot of things that are very important to unpack. So very quickly, I think, and the reason why I said I agree with both of you, issue is capacities. When we do assessments in most of these environments, we find that there is liquidity, but it's just how to get that liquidity down. So the money exists, it's there floating within the local circles. But just to give you a quick example, what we have done is something, and IFAD actually prides itself by, we see ourselves as the grassroots global fund, because we work with smallholder producers and really the most vulnerable. But very quickly, we did the Caisse de Résilience in DRC, in CAR, in Liberia, in Mali, and in Burundi. What we've done here is we've actually used the social and the local community funds that actually exist, savings and credit groups that exist in the local communities. And all we did there was plug in the technical support, so build capacity of the local communities, how to be able to withstand resilience in the face of shocks. And remember, preventative, not about reactive. So we try to build that preventive, grounds for them to be able, and this Caisse de Résilience is working really well. And then, of course, the financial institutions come in and they pump in the money into this. But you have a social cohesion, because the communities have their own system in place. Then you have the technical building on top of that, and then comes the financing.
Great.
I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Go ahead.
It's working, and I love this example, by the way. So one of the examples when you give the money in the right place. I get a prices from a private organizations, and I invested these prices to do a fantastic project that the people who know me talk always about it. Linking science, technology, and traditional knowledge. I built a 2D participatory mapping, this is the recently one, around Lake Chad. I map over 3,500 kilometers squares, more than 556 villages, place of stop of the nomadic communities, islands, etc. And this map ended by help the community to map their land, to mitigate the conflict over resources, to better manage the resources, and help the government to use it for the National Adaptation Plan. Look at the National Adaptation Plan of Chad. You can have a paragraph on traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples through the mapping. So if you invest in a right place, I think the income is not always on cash, but the income is all the nature that you cannot value only by money. Thank you.
Great. Claire, go for it.
Thank you. I think these are some very good examples. I think humanitarian organizations need to be able to think about what they do in terms of being climate sensitive as well as dealing with an emergency need. That's one thing. I think we do see it work from our perspective. I mean, coming, yes, to the Sahel, to Lake Chad, I think where we work alongside local organizations, whether it's the Red Cross or Red Crescent of those countries, who understand the needs of communities, and then we can adapt our programming to meet those, and also be, as I think one other speaker mentioned, conflict sensitive, so they don't make any tensions that may exist worse, and take into the account the needs of both the host communities and displaced people, which is quite a lot to do, but it can work on really quite a simple level, whether that's helping communities with strengthening flood mechanisms, or maybe it's about particular sorts of seeds or agricultural interventions. But I think it's really that combination of the knowledge, as you say. You know, there's the science, but also there's the practitioner, there's the community understanding of what will work and what won't. And then there's this idea of what is conflict-sensitive programming, and equally climate-sensitive. So from our organizations, we can't be giving responses or interventions that perhaps may make the situation worse over time. So we've got to think about agriculture, water, they're all interconnected, electricity, or example of electric cars, you know, all of these things, and use the science and the expertise around us and listen to the communities.
Okay, great. Habib, do you want to come in at this point? And audience, you're coming next, so I'm going to pick on somebody. So give us, okay, you're on. Habib, go for it.
Yes, just a couple of points. Thank you so much. So first of all, I mentioned the Declaration on Relief, Recovery, and Peace, and I really, really hope that we take it for serious, you know, with a serious intention and implement that. This declaration is based on our collective experiences from the G7+ countries. That's one thing. And the second thing that I have to mention is that one of the reasons that these countries are fragile is conflict. And we need to bring the peace nexus into our actions in this, so that they could be resilient in order to cope with the emergencies that are happening in these countries. So peace is a necessary foundation in these countries. And of course, as speakers mentioned, the climate-related shocks also contribute to conflict. But when the community is in peace, we can cope with other challenges. Thank you.
Great. Okay, go for it. So, do you have a great example?
Yeah, well,
or do you have a wish?
Yeah, I am the witness of a bit of problem of finance in Colombia. We are working with communities, developing projects for protecting the environment, but we have seen many obstacles related with that. First of all, Colombia ended a climate armed conflict from about 50 years. And ironically, after the conflict ended, a lot of deforestation start to be visible because the people start to return into the areas. So there is a big issue because the ecosystem, the intact forest. So I would like they hear, so in that way they can answer, because anyway. The ecosystem, the intact ecosystems provide, they capture around 6 gigatons of CO2, but they are not profitable. So when we develop a project, we need that counts for the investor, but we need also that counts for the communities, and that's not easy. So the question is that how we can make that the ecosystem counts, because for the communities, because they need to be profitable. So in that way, they need to deforest to start to get an income. And also, because of that, because of the lack of incomes and lack of alternatives, small criminal groups started to, again, started a conflict, a small conflict again, right. So we need that.
Okay, so we're at the last stretch now, and we need to start wrapping up. So I'm going to grant each of you a wish. You just became the head of your organization. You are the one in charge, each of you.
Okay, I'm leaving to a panel that they are waiting for me and to the negotiation.
Thank you very much for participating.
My wish is really the financial institutions adapt to the peoples. It's not the peoples that can adapt to the financial institution.
Great.
And thank you so much.
Okay, that's one. So we have one. Dauda, what is your wish to try and address this issue?
No, my wish is just to be realistic, okay? So being the head of a financial institution, coming from the global south, we are 100% from the global south, so we understand the issues of the global south. We are realistic, not to expect any magic coming from, you know, some vertical funds or whatever coming. So local banks, we invest, we keep investing in equity, in Islamic finance institutions, microfinance institutions. What we would do is to make sure that we get more green line of credits to these institutions so that they could provide cheaper financing available for private sector and community to deal with climate issues.
Great. Cynthia?
My wish is to work more closely with organizations can teach us how to speak the local language and how to adapt to the local people. That's really my wish. There's always plenty of room to learn, and I think that's certainly a key lesson for those of us who work on adaptation and resilience, as the needs are far too large, far too vast. We cannot meet all the needs of all the different stakeholders. So please help us learn more to, how to speak the local language and collaborate with organizations that really have their roots on the ground. Thank you.
Great. Claire?
I think it would be a wish for a fund that can disperse both large and small scale quickly, without too much bureaucracy, that is accessible to all kinds of actors. And there's a way to kind of govern that I would say, and I say that very humbly coming from bureaucracy, that isn't managed by us, the UN, or an institution in that sense, but maybe by perhaps it's banks or financiers who really understand how this works. And there's no sort of vested interest in disbursement. But I think speed is really important.
Great. Habib, what's your wish?
My wish is that the multilateral institutions who are custodians of billions of these dollars, they allow the countries to decide what resilience means for them, rather than using their own yardstick to measure risks. And my wish is that these countries are empowered to identify their destiny for resilience and also for climate adaptation.
Right. Okay, so I think all of these wishes can be realized because they seem so practical and within our reach. So I want to thank all of you for being part of this discussion and for engaging very actively. And I want to thank all the panelists also for being good sports with my last minute change of format. So thank you very much, everyone.